Howdy, all. This is your beloved film teacher from Shasta College, Humanities 4. Hope your weekend was interesting and hope you guys are safe out there and getting your papers in. I just now started grading the last essays, so have some patience on that. This week is we're getting up to midterms, and so we're going to have a quiz. So I'm going to sign a movie today. It's already up on Canvas. It's a documentary called Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. It's about this era of Hollywood from about 1969 to about 1980 that I started focusing on last week. I want to focus on this week also because it's an important era. When you're looking at the movie, take notes. I'm going to give you a couple days to watch it, and I'm going to sign the test at the end of this week. And the test is going to be only open for 12 hours. Okay. So you're going to have about 3 days between now and maybe Thursday to watch this movie and take notes. And then I'm going to assign a test, and you have 12 hours to complete the test and hand it in on Canvas like you do everything else. If you miss the test, the quiz, there's no makeup. You'll have to write an extra essay for less points. I think the quiz will be worth about 15 points. So it's important you get this message. It's important that you check in on announcements. I'm going to put this all up on announcements. So you'll have several days to watch this film. You better start watching it right now. And probably on Thursday, I'll sign the questions. There'll be 3 or 4 questions based on the documentary, and they're essay questions. And I will go into more detail later, but they're going to be you're going to be analyzing just like you're doing with the movies you're watching right now. Okay. To give you some historical, cultural context, what's going on in the world, what's going on in our world. This is an American movie about American Hollywood films. We're not in Europe right now or Asia. We are in locally grown Hollywood, and that's where the revolution happened. And I got into it just a little last week, but there's a couple movies being made in the late 60s that changed the course of cinema history due to the fact that Hollywood, the old Hollywood, had lost its ability to connect with the young audience. That's people under 25, people in college. They weren't digging the films that Hollywood was producing. They're staying home in droves. They're doing other things. And the adults, their parents were staying home and watching TV. They'd given up on going to movies altogether. And so Hollywood had lost a huge chunk of its audience. They were actually some studios are going bankrupt. They were foreclosing on their properties. Some of them had to start selling off their properties where they had movie studios, where they built sets, New York City set, old Western sets. They had to start selling that stuff off to pay their debts. And so they're selling off the history of Hollywood to pay debts because they didn't know how to capitalize on a new market. Television had siphoned off most of the market, and Hollywood reacted by making some blockbusters that were not successful. I'm not saying they're bad movies. They just were out of step with what the audience was needing. And if anything Hollywood knows how to do, and they still do, is they kind of know the pulse of the culture. For instance, what's going on in the culture now? What is going on in your culture right now? And when I say culture, what's going on, politics, what's going on with the pandemic, what's going on with warfare, what's going on with Black Lives Matter, what's going on with mass shootings. That's our culture, folks. That's out there. What's going on out there? How is it affecting the movies that they're making in Hollywood right now. Is it? Anyway, what was going on in the culture when this movie that you're going to watch, Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, um, what's going on? Well, there's a lot. What's going on? One of the main things that's going on is this thing called the Vietnam War. And there was a draft, folks. You could be drafted, men under the age of 26 could be drafted into the Army. And a lot of those men, boys, were going to have to fight in Vietnam. And over almost 60,000 of them were killed. So it was a big hot topic button. Protests were on the campus, unrest was on the campus. Our leaders were not giving us what we felt we needed. Why were we fighting? Supposedly, we're fighting communism in a country nobody had ever heard of, Vietnam. What gives it that? Who are we helping here? And so the kids, the young people, college students, started taking to the streets to protest. Well, first of all, they didn't want to go to fight in this war that they didn't understand. This is not World War II, folks, where there was the good enemy like Germany or Japan. We didn't even know this enemy, communism. We had been indoctrinated into hating communists all of our lives, and we didn't understand it. But was it really a threat to our lives here in America? That was the big question. And John F. Kennedy got us going over there before he was assassinated. He felt to send troops there to start, because China was trying to influence Vietnam. They're right on the border of Vietnam, North Vietnam, and they're communist. And so Vietnam was two countries, a country divided into North and South, and the South supposedly wanted democracy. They didn't want to be communist. And so John F. Kennedy started sending some troops and advisors there. This is early on, folks, very few, but he did, to kind of get the lay of the land, to see what's going on, and to do some training of the troops in Vietnam. And within 3 or 4 years of his assassination, the war had escalated from maybe 1,500 advisors to 500,000 guys, young boys fighting communism. That's how quickly it escalated. And they needed bodies to go in the army, and they didn't depend on an all volunteer army like they do now. They depended on a draft. So they established a draft. This led to protests in college campuses, people burning their draft cards, good kids, good students who did not want to go fight in what they felt was an unjust war. So that's a main cultural backdrop to what's going on in the world in the 60s. Then we have the civil rights movement. African Americans still had not got a fair shake. They didn't have voting rights everywhere. There was still Jim Crow in some parts of the country. Jim Crow is a racist policy of keeping Black Americans down and not allowing them to vote, not allowing them to have credit cards, not allowing them to buy houses. Essentially a holdout from slavery. Jim Crow is a term that comes from old vaudeville and entertainment times, as a character who was silly and foolish and essentially a slave to white people, there for their enjoyment. You can legally lynch somebody in certain counties in America in those days. Then we had civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, who was very much influenced by Gandhi, the Indian leader who went up against powerful Indian government and was assassinated for it, but he went up against the government with peace and the power of religion, no guns. And he brought the Indian government down to its knees. Martin Luther King took the lesson. He was a minister, reverend, and so he started delivering his peaceful message of resistance, but nonviolent resistance. The government was terrified of him. FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, wanted him out of the way. They had a huge file on him. They wanted, because he was causing trouble in the Black community. And whenever that happens, the government sometimes thinks they're doing what they think is the best, is actually based on ignorance and racism. But the government was terrified of what the power Martin Luther King had in the Black community. People started to demand their rights. The large parts of the South, you still couldn't, as a Black human being, you still couldn't eat in certain restaurants, go to restrooms. You couldn't travel safely. People were being killed all the time. He was fighting against that. And white people were fighting back. Even the FBI. On the other spectrum, there was another Black leader named Malcolm X, who was not a pacifist. And he was preaching resistance through armed resistance. And he had a large, large following. The Black Panthers were one, and he was considered very, very dangerous to white America. He was assassinated, folks. He was assassinated by, we're not sure who, possibly there was a segment of Black Americans, the Black Muslims, they think they perhaps killed him. Martin Luther King was assassinated by a lone gunman in a hotel, white gunman. In the meantime, John F. Kennedy's killed. His brother Robert is running for president. 1968, he just won the California primary for Democratic nominee for president. He was going to run against Richard Nixon, and he too was assassinated. So it looked like all of our leaders, every time someone was out there trying to do good, were being killed for it. This is what's going on in the culture. Unrest of the highest order. Then the women's movement. Women still, until early 70s, could not have a charge card, a credit card in their own name. Yes, folks, look it up. You had to have a man's name on it, your husband's. You couldn't get credit as a woman. They were sick and tired of being second-class citizens. And so there was unrest, and feminism raised its head for equality, for pay equality, for job equality, for being treated equally as the male world. And so that was happening. And throw in the mix of rock and roll. We've got the Monterey Pop Festival with the Jimi Hendrix and the Who and Janis Joplin and Otis Redding and Jefferson Airplane. They all performed there in 1967, and people were starting to see a different way of looking at the world around them. That maybe music, smoking marijuana, taking LSD could bring everybody together in a nonviolent world. This didn't set well with the establishment. who are still holding on to their vodka martinis and their old school way of doing things. Women have to know their place. Blacks should know their place. These kids with the long hair don't have any idea what their place is, and their music is lousy. Then there was more major cultural shift with music when Woodstock happened in 1969. People never seen anything like this. 500,000 people watched people like Jimi Hendrix and Ravi Shankar and the Who, and 10 years after, and they had never. Nobody was. There was no violence. There was lots of drug taking, lots of sex, folks. Um, Everybody got along. 3 days of raining, lots of mud, not enough toilets, but it was all worth it. And it changed things. That was happening in the culture. 1969 was a bumper year of change in the culture. Later on in 1969, Charles Manson appeared and his murderous hippies, and they murdered their way into the infamous death knell of the hippie dream. They weren't hippies, folks. They're psychotic, homeless drug users who fell under the spell of a false prophet and murdered for it. That same year that Manson happened, that was probably in August. That same year in December, the Rolling Stones, a rock band, came out and they put on a concert, a free concert at the Altamont Speedway, which is down by Modesto in California. Several 100,000 people showed up, and it was a disaster. They, instead of peace and love and everybody tripping out on good drugs, and listening to music, there was nothing but violence from start to finish. The drugs were bad. The security was provided by the Hells Angels, and even though they appeared to be outlaws, they hated hippies. They hated hippies, folks. They're the wrong people to be guarding the stage. And during the concert, several people were severely beaten, and one was killed. When we get into documentaries in a couple of weeks, you'll be seeing some excerpts from a great documentary called "Gimme Shelter." So that didn't bode well for the 60s. In the midst of this, some movies started rearing their heads to showing us a different way of looking at the world around us. Bonnie and Clyde helped start it. 1967, The Graduate, 1967 helped start it. And then all of a sudden, there was a phenomenon movie called Easy Rider, made for about $300,000 or $400,000, and made a lot of money, folks, in the box office, and the kids adored it. The kids adored all these movies, and Hollywood didn't know how to capitalize on it. But the new directors who had gone to film school knew how to capitalize on it. Let them tell their stories. Give them the money to finance their films to tell the stories that the youth market could relate to. And it gave rise to the auteur director. I talked about it last week. The auteur director, the word means author of your own work. And these young filmmakers coming out of film school like George Lucas and Steve Spielberg, Martin Scorsese and Francis Coppola, John Milius, Paul Schrader, they were going to change everything because they looked at film differently than the Hollywood status quo. They loved the French New Wave, what Truffaut and what was Godard was doing. They paid attention to Fellini, what he was doing. They paid attention to Italian neorealism. They saw a different way to tell a story, not Hollywood slick. They wanted to tell their stories. They needed to tell their stories. They had no choice but to tell their stories. And once Easy Rider made that kind of money, Hollywood, which really only understands money, seems like, wanted more. And so that's where the documentary I want you to watch starts. The auteurs are storming the gates. And they had a good run. It lasted on and off for about 10 years. Where some people, and I'm one of them, but I'm just a lowly film teacher in Redding, California, cinephile, lifelong studied cinema all my life, filmmaker. This was the decade that meant everything to my generation, the baby boomers. Your grandparents, maybe? I don't know. It made me want to become a filmmaker, a director. I would see these movies and say, that's what I wanted to do. How do I do this? What do I do to get this? And that's how powerful the draw was. And some of the greatest cinema in our history of cinema was made during this 10-year period. And this movie, Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, will have some of the major ones, and they leave out a lot of them too. There's another documentary that goes along with it. I'm not going to make you watch both of them, called A Decade Under the Influence. And they cover films that this one doesn't, because a few filmmakers didn't want to participate in this one. But there's a great book called Easy Rider, Raging Bulls that I read it many years ago. Then they made the movie afterwards. These guys that changed everything. Martin Scorsese's first movie, Mean Streets, Terrence Malick's first movie, Badlands, Coppola's first movie, second movie, The Rain People. George Lucas's first movie, folks, was not Star Wars. That wasn't American Graffiti. That was huge. That came out in 73, right in the middle of this decade. He had made a small film when he was a student called 11 THX 1138, a futuristic story it bombed at the box office, but it established him as a filmmaker to watch. Robert Altman was making MASH, The Long Goodbye, Nashville, Thieves Like Us. Hal Ashby was making Harold and Maude, The Last Detail, Shampoo, all made in the 70s and all changed the face of cinema. Bob Rafelson, who had started in television, directed one of the greatest movies of all time called Five Easy Pieces with a very young Jack Nicholson. Once again, these are game changers, and that's what this documentary covers. And they're all produced through the studios of Hollywood. This is long before we have independent films. That we get independent films later in the 90s, but not yet. These powerful, powerful, small films about characters driven by the times they're living in, not by special effects. Nobody's wearing a cape. Nobody's flying around and saving the day. They're all messed up individuals trying to survive their times. And these are powerful movies. And they did good enough at the box office, well enough, I should say, that Hollywood moguls said, give us more. And within the 10 years, it all came to an end. Through excess, through all sorts of things, it came to an end. But that's what's going on in the world. That's what's driving these filmmakers to make these powerful stories. Read chapter 8, folks, in the book, your textbook. Remember that? There's a lot of European stuff in that, but it's always good to know that stuff also, because that's what's happening out there in Europe while this is happening in Hollywood. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. We're going to continue this discussion. We'll be talking about a subgenre of this movement called blaxploitation. Until then, remember, everything is cinema, and the story of film will continue. See you later.